All right, welcome to this webinar out of China. We are still a little bit early, but if you are online, just stay with us. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, so just stay with us. All right, so if you're just joining us for this webinar, we're going to wait for another 2 minutes just to get more people, and then we'll get started. So please be patient, and we'll get started soon. All right, I would like to welcome all of you to this new webinar organized by the Global Supply Chain Council in partnership with Dragon Sourcing. Again, this is a webinar called All of China, which we're going to be talking, which is a pretty hot topic right now, with more and more companies looking to diversify their supply base away from China. There are a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about de-risking, decoupling, nearshoring as a result of what has been happening the last few years in China, and also with the ongoing trade tensions between China, the United States, and Europe. We're very pleased today to have two speakers. We're going to be hearing from Richard Laub, who is the CEO of Dragon Sourcing. He will also be joined by Knut Spæren, who is the VP of International Sourcing at a company called Europris. We want also to remind you that this session is going to be very interactive. We want to hear from you, so please ask questions. You can do so by clicking on the Q&A button located at the bottom of the screen. So if you have a question for either Richard or Knut, you can ask it at any time, and then we will try to take all of them during the Q&A session after the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to again welcome Richard and Knut to join us and deliver the presentation. Welcome, Richard. Welcome. Richard, you muted.
There we go. Sorry, there we go. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where everybody is located. Thank you very much for joining in today. Let me see if I can scroll this down. There we go. So yes, very briefly, I'm the CEO of Dragon Sourcing, and Knut is the VP of International Sourcing for Europris. And so I suggest we do a very, very quick introduction about Europris. I'm going to pass it on to Knut, who will give us a few words of introduction about Europris.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm Knut Spæren, the VP of International Sourcing in Europris. And Europris is Norway's #1 discount variety retailer, a listed company with stores, as you can see, all over the country. We are known by all consumers in Norway. We have a strong brand and a loyal customer base. And we are known by selling a fixed assortment of dry goods, a lot of non-food categories, and are strong at seasonal goods like garden in the summer and Christmas in the winter time. We are famous for low prices, and we are a powerful marketing and campaign engine. Every week, we distribute a lot of leaflets, physical and online newsletters, to almost all mailboxes in Norway. We have a proven category management model and we managed to develop that constantly, and we think that's very, very important. The one that's developed the fastest, he will be the winner. And for example, then when the situation in the market is changing, we have managed then to turn more towards consumables and things that are consumed in not high price points. And we are expanding both the physical store network and the e-commerce. We are 30 years old, and you can also see then the development going forward. Our key strategies is in 4 areas. It is improving customer experience, drive customer growth, act responsibly, and strengthen the price and cost position. In the strengthened price and cost position, we are working also together with Tokmanni in Finland. They are the biggest retailer of discount variety stores in Finland and have a joint venture, for instance, sourcing office in China and so on. At the same time, we are constantly also working with supply chain, automation, and to finding efficient solutions. And coming to the acting responsibly, we are strengthening our sustainable team. We are recycling a lot of the cartons and emballages, and we are also using biofuel by deep sea freight from the Far East. And we think the Europris concept is favorable under tough conditions prevailing in the retail market. Like many other places, we see that interest rate is going up. The Norwegian currency is quite weak, and people are feeling this every day. So they tend to turn to us, and we are in a good position. By being a discounter with strong campaigns, as you can see from the leaflet to the right, you also see some of our goods. This was from this summer, and we are in a very, very strong position and are doing quite well also in this situation. Then I leave it to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Knut. So very briefly about Dragon Sourcing. Dragon Sourcing, we've been in business for nearly 20 years. We basically provide global sourcing services to our clients, either on a project basis or on an outsourcing basis. So we do manage also buying offices on behalf of our clients in some of these emerging markets. In terms of footprint, we can cover most of the important emerging markets. So we work in Southeast Asia, we work in India, we work in Eastern Europe, in Turkey, in the Gulf countries, in East Africa, North Africa, South Africa, Latin America, and Mexico. And of course, we also work in China, of course, that's where we have our biggest office. In terms of resources, we have approximately 50 buyers on our team, on the payroll. We have a pool of freelancers that we work with on a very frequent basis to cover the countries where we don't have our own people, approximately 100 plus people. And then we've also got, we've launched a platform called procurementfreelancers.com, which is a niche, specialized freelancers platform for procurement. And on that platform, there's another 5,000 plus freelancers that, by the way, anybody can access. So if you're on the lookout for specific freelancers, you can, of course, connect to that particular website and identify some potential experts for you. We've developed specifically around this out of China sourcing program, a key capability that's really a very, very hot topic. Most of our clients are really looking to try to reduce their dependency on China and look for alternative suppliers. So in order to respond, we truly have local presence in each of the key supply markets with experienced people. I was mentioning the key geographies before. We have this freelancers platform, which gives us access to 5,000 plus freelancers that we can also leverage in these types of programs. We have a global sourcing platform, which connects all of the buyers, whether they are freelancers or on the Dragon Sourcing payroll with the clients, with the suppliers, so everybody can work using the same templates, the same timeline, the same process. And then we also have a capability to rapidly identify potentially attractive countries outside of China. There's lots of countries, of course, potentially. Difficult to scan the whole world, so it's important to try to focus very rapidly on the few countries which appear to be potentially attractive for particular categories of products. And we are now also investing quite heavily on AI to try to help us, again, identify more rapidly suppliers that have the right kind of products to respond to our clients' requirements. And then we also have an attractive business model to try to make it not too financially risky for clients to engage in these types of programs. So that's very briefly about Dragon Sourcing. I'm going to talk very briefly here about some key drivers. What is driving this trend of trying to reduce dependency on China? We all know that China has become the factory of the world. It used to be 20 years ago, the exports were around $350 billion. We're now around 10 times that number in 2021. But of course, key issues have arisen. Of course, political tensions. We all know that between China and the rest of the world, tensions are rising. There are inflationary tensions in China. Costs are increasing in China, labor costs and other costs as well. So the competitive position is not the same as it used to be in the past. Some countries, particularly in the US, have imposed some import barriers. There's some high tariffs for some key products going from China to the US, and that's of course having a big impact. There are the supply chain tensions. They were exacerbated by COVID, where lots of suppliers were having a hard time delivering, and transportation costs went through the roof. So that of course also has raised awareness about the risk associated with Asia sourcing. And then of course environmental tensions. Everybody wants to try to reduce their carbon footprint, and hence reducing the supply chain lead time is also a key topic for many companies. So consequently, many procurement departments are now looking to reduce their dependency on China. And equally, governments, there's also a strategic implication here for the US government, for the EU, for Australia, looking to repatriate some strategic supply chains, in the medical space and the semiconductor space. Countries like the US, the EU, and others are really looking to reduce their dependency on China for many of these categories. Here are some examples of where China is dominant. I've taken some of the top 10 categories, and you can see in red the China part, the China share of the world exports, and in yellow, the country number 2. So you can see in most cases, China is number 1, and you can see that usually number 2 is a far distant number 2. So you can really see how dominant China is in many, many of these key categories. And then here's some examples of companies that have decided to reduce their dependency on China. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can kind of, scan through this quite quickly, but you can see it's across different types of industries, definitely across the US and the EU, and also Japan to some extent. So it is really a pervasive trend with many, many companies in all types of sectors that are looking to shift some of their production from China to countries like India, Vietnam, Mexico, Eastern Europe, and what have you. And then what are the key challenges? Because of course, companies have this intent to try to reduce their dependency on China, but it's not so easy. China still has a lot going for itself. It's still a formidable competitor. And so, it's not an easy journey. It's not as if you can instantaneously find some immediate opportunities and cost reductions. And I think Knut will be talking to that when going through the case study. So what are some of the challenges? Well, first, the installed capacity. When you're a large retailer like Europris and you've got big volumes, much of the installed capacity is in China. And, just finding that capacity outside of China is not so easy. So that's clearly one of the key issues for the big buyers. China also has access to all of the key raw materials at competitive pricing. So, whenever you're looking to source from India or from Vietnam or from Eastern Europe, quite frequently they are at a disadvantage around the raw materials. And the labor cost advantage they have in assembly, for the assembly of the final product, is sometimes not sufficient to compensate for the disadvantage they might have on the raw material side. China has a very strong infrastructure, both logistical infrastructure and also legal infrastructure right now. So it's kind of reassuring for companies, they can be sure that when they place orders, that those orders will be delivered, and that they will be somewhat protected also nowadays in terms of IP and those types of issues which are of concern to many companies. They're also mostly compliant, not all the time, but mostly compliant on ESG and CSR issues. They've been working with the Western world for the last 20 years. They know exactly what they need to comply with in terms of regulations and certifications, and many suppliers in other countries have not that level of maturity compared to the Chinese suppliers. So that can also be a bit of a roadblock when looking for suppliers outside of China. Chinese companies also now have strong innovation and adaptability capabilities. For many years, they were just kind of a Me Too type country. They were just copying, if you will, products made in the Western world, but that's no longer the case. Chinese suppliers can be innovative, can bring new products to the market, and are quite adept at helping companies create differentiation with their innovative products into the Western markets. And like I said before, they're well versed in Western procurement practices and ethics. So they understand what the ethics are in the Western world for how procurement has to be managed. And quite frequently, when we work in other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia or in India or sometimes in Mexico, suppliers don't really have that level of understanding about what the expectations might be from the Western buyers. So that's in a nutshell the key issue that we have. So what I suggest we do now is that we pass it on to Knut, that has worked with Dragon Sourcing and is still working with Dragon Sourcing on trying to identify suppliers. As Knut indicated, they have a big buying office in China, but they're faced with some of the issues which I was just describing. And so we have worked with Knut and tried to help his team of buyers to identify suppliers outside of China. So I'll pass it on to you, Knut.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you are right, Richard. We were in touch with you because we wanted a more analytical process on the sourcing part. Normally, we head for trade fairs and contacting all known suppliers that we know of, but we wanted to do this a little bit differently to see what is the real base and take it from there. And it started when we selected 50 product groups and presented them to Dragon Sourcing and said that we want to focus on the Eastern Europe. And they made this heat map of the 50 product groups in order to see who is the big exporter out of the single groups. And as hotter it is, it's ending up turning red. And that made a very good guidance to see which country should we focus on. I think you can go to the next, Richard. And we ended up picking these groups. So we did it for freezer bags, shopping bags, and so on, plastic storage, disposables, candles, socks, and windshield liquid. Some of them is also already been produced and sourced from Europe, but it's a combination that we wanted. Some is from the Far East, and some is from Europe. So we ended up selecting these 6 categories. And then we started with your so-called HS codes and who is exporting these kind of goods. And then we got a number of companies. As you can see, a very large number. Only from Turkey on the freezer bags to the top, we see 66 suppliers. And then we got the big list and the long list from Dragon Sourcing, and our buyers went through them one by one with the information they had access to, very often quite brief information, but you could see if they were producing a product at the same level and at the same kind of products that we were looking for. Then we ended up by 217 in the end. And you can see that the 66 from freezer bags from Turkey was reduced to 30. When the buyers had looked it through and said, well, this is similar to what I sell and demand today. Then we made some pre-screening questions, because in this phase, Dragon Sourcing are contacting every supplier and ask them some concrete questions. That's quite important. And if you are a buyer or sourcing today, you will see that there are many traders. We actually don't want traders if they don't contribute to the process. So we were looking specifically for manufacturers. So that was the first question. We want to leave out the one that are trading. And also, where is your production? Are you selling from Eastern Europe but producing in China? Well, that's not what we were looking for. And how easy and how comfortable are you with exporting directly? And also some certificates and standards on quality and processes we also demanded. And also, since we are selling a large part of private labels, we wanted also only to be in touch with companies that are able to produce after our requirements. And in the end, do you have free capacity for new clients? Being aware that many in the Eastern Europe might not be having that free capacity. Then, in common, we made an RFI and an RFQ template. And this was the example. I think we need to pay attention also to that one to get a good feedback from the suppliers, and sometimes not make it too complicated, because then you lower the interest for the factory to answer that. And here you can see we ranked them after the response of the RFI. So on the number, I don't see the screen myself even, but there is a number of elements that we can value after what we consider important or not. So
yeah, on this page, this is the RFI score. So
yeah.
When we get all of the responses back from the suppliers, we have on the platform an algorithm which analyzes all the data and scored the suppliers on a scale of 0 to 100. So you can see the ones on the left were the ones which, of course, had the highest score, hence were shortlisted for the next phase. Yeah.
Exactly. We use that then to later on select to whom we are asking RFQs. And we have also made a detailed company profiles. I think this is quite important, because it's a lot of information that we were not aware of came to the surface when we asked this. So when we are selecting suppliers, we pay quite much attention to this. And some key statistics then, because we started with 685 suppliers. And I think you can show it all, more or less. And then we went down to 217 when we had looked it through. But it continued to be reduced. We saw that, it went down to 78 after the phone screening. And 35 suppliers was responding to the RFQ. And in the end, we are still working with and have done changes of suppliers on a number of around 15. And that was also a quite much a learning process, starting with a very high number and having, of course, a lot of information about the 685 and 217, ending up just a few, because it's not about finding a supplier, you know, it's about finding the right supplier. And that's why it's a lot of companies that are checked out of the process so far. And here there are also easy here to do some mistakes. For instance, going from 685 to 217, I think we learned a lot during that process, because in some product groups, we ended having too few. When we done the phone screening and we saw that people were not responding, well, the competitive landscape was quite small. So we went back and added more companies to the shortlisted. So, but very learningful and very fruitful process. And it turned out in the end to be, I would say, a nice outcome.
And I think it's a very important lesson for everybody listening here. You really have to collect a lot of data from a lot of suppliers in order to achieve some good results. As you can see, a ratio of 15 out of 685. And this is not unusual. We do many of these types of programs, and the kind of statistics which are shown here are pretty representative of what we usually find when we do this kind of work in Eastern Europe or in Southeast Asia, or we even sometimes do it in North Africa or Mexico. It's you have to really get in touch with many companies, many suppliers, in order to really hit a few winners.
Yeah, and at the same time, there are no shortcuts possible here, because you know, it can be only web shops, it can be agents, it can be branded suppliers. So you really need to look into this and check out everyone out of the 685 to end up, for instance, like the 217 that are still on the list. And because the base for the information is exporting. And that's also the good thing about it, because, you know, walking around in trade fairs and so on, you can find many suppliers, but you don't get that total picture. So I think this has been very valuable for us. And based on that, and based on the outcome, we have also initiated a phase 2 in our project together with Dragon Sourcing. And here you see pots and pans, glass casseroles, wooden briquettes, and chemicals, and a lot of things. So we are in the middle of a project now. We have done the first phase, we have done the phone screening, and we are now looking forward to, in some weeks, also see then the feedback on the RFQs on these groups. And if I should comment on some takeaway then, of course, you need to consider the risk, and it's in a way considering Eastern Europe for us was also risk management and sustainability. At the same time, one of the important takeaways is probably that the workload for the client, for us as a customer towards Dragon Sourcing, starts when we get the RFQs. It's so easy to think that, well, then it's ready made. But by sending an RFQ, everybody knows that it's not the best price, it's not the last price, and there is technical specs and things to be reviewed. So also for the buyers, it was a little bit surprised that the workload was coming so late, and no shortcuts is possible. We need to do our work. And I would also say, like, if you are a supplier in this picture, an Apex supplier, for instance, I would say that it's extremely important going forward to be efficient and do the math. Layers from historical reasons is not possible anymore, and also not to underestimate the sustainable aspect. I think it's important then to consider the dependency, and if you decide to try to reduce it, I think Dragon Sourcing, for us at least, has proved to be giving us a good process and support, so we're able to do and explore these opportunities. But it's not either or. We don't think that we will leave China or leave suppliers in China. It's a combination. Risk management for us is maybe sharing the need of goods in a category between, for instance, Eastern Europe and China. I don't think we will in the near future, or as long as I can see, will leave the factory of the world. But they will maybe deliver a little bit smaller share than they had previously been doing. I'll leave it back to you, Richard.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this description of the case study. As you indicate, we're in the middle of this new wave of products, so we'll see what comes back. And you've added also Southeast Asia to this particular program, so we're doing Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia.
Exactly. That was one of the learnings, actually. Yeah, that was one of the learnings that we also added Southeast Asia to the list.
Okay, so before we go into the Q&A, what I suggest we do is a quick, very quick poll. I think we prepared a couple of questions, which we're going to put on the screen. So yeah, let me quickly explain how this works. The first question is rather simple. You can see we're just asking participants here whether they are currently or planning to engage in a program of this nature. Yes or no. So you can just kind of respond yes or no to that particular question as I speak. And then the second question is just asking you for the priority countries which you're focusing on, for those of you that are looking for suppliers outside of China. So you have to scroll down. You can see you can scroll down on the right-hand side there of that little screen for the second question. So you can see you can now include your top priority country. So there is one choice only. You can put one country or one region for the top priority. Between Eastern Europe, Turkey, India, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, or other. And then once you've responded to your top priority, you scroll down and you can put in your second priority country. And then if you continue to scroll down a bit further down to the end of the poll, you can put in your third priority country. So if everybody wants to participate and respond to those simple questions, and then when we get the feedback and the responses back, we'll show the results back with the audience. Okay,
yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah.
I suggest we pass it on now, maybe to Max for the Q&A.
Yeah, so thank you again, Richard and Knut, for this very interesting presentation. I would just want to remind everybody that, because I see a number of questions popping up already in the chat, please do not use the chat, otherwise it's going to be very difficult for us to find it and use it. I want to again remind you to use the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of the screen. So if you have a question for either Richard or Knut or both of them together, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A button again at the bottom of your screen. So let me start maybe by taking some of the questions which came up during your talk. Maybe let's start with a question from this is from Amour. He's asking if you are discussing only consumer goods or API/KSM, etc., used in pharma companies. I think this is probably a question for you, Richard.
No, we are working really across the sector. So this particular example here, of course, is in the retail sector. But, we've been working with many clients in different sectors. To be honest with you, I don't think we've got an example in the pharma industry, but we've worked in automotive, we've worked in chemicals and construction and other areas where companies have the same concern. I would say, though, I would add that probably the retail space is probably the one which is the most exposed to China. If China is extremely strong, it is particularly strong in many consumer goods. And so the large retailers, be it in the US or in the EU, those are the companies that are probably, from a percentage perspective, the highest exposed to being sourcing from China. So those companies, I would say, are probably the ones which are most aggressively looking to reduce their dependency, but they're not the only ones. Cross-sector, this is a trend which we're observing in just about everywhere.
Okay, let's take another question. This is coming from Ashdeep, who's asking, while this is an insightful example, most of our products are those where we might have a transactional relationship with a supplier. However, in some categories, we need to have a more strategic relationship with a supplier, given the nature of product compliance or transparency requirements. What strategy can be used for such case? This is probably a question for both of you here.
You go first.
Knut, you want to take a shot at that?
You can go first if you want.
Yeah. No, I think you know, I'm not so sure that these products are more transactional than you know, than other categories in other industries. You know, if you're a retail company, each of these categories are strategic and important, and there's lots of compliance issues associated with all of these categories when you're selling them to consumers in Western Europe and North America. So I think the issues around developing strategic relationships and developing those relationships with those suppliers is critical in retail, but also in other sectors. So I don't really see much of a difference in what needs to be done in terms of supply relationship management in the retail space than what you might observe in other industries. It is true, of course, that the qualification process can be lengthier if you're working in automotive or defense or other industries. You know, qualifying a new supplier can sometimes be a lot more complicated if you're kind of trying to qualify, you know, a new supplier for automotive than you are in the retail space. So from that perspective, it might be more difficult to find and switch suppliers in certain industries than others. But other than that, I think that you know, whichever industry you operate in, you know, developing those strong supply relationships is pretty critical. But Knut, you've got a
I can only confirm. In many product groups, product seems quite simple, but the cooperation. We have long-term relationship to very many suppliers and cooperating very tight with them, also in the Far East. And for sure, it's strategic. It's costly to do changes, and we build also on the logistical side and so on. So it's. I totally agree with you, Richard, on this.
Okay.
Okay, let's take another question. This is coming from Chi Kyang, who's asking, from the earlier charts, China seems to dominate over 90% of the furniture business, but your potential product sourcing categories do not show on furniture. Richard or Knut?
Well, I don't know, Knut, do you actually do furniture in Europris?
We do some garden furniture, ODF and so on, and smaller furniture. And I think it's right. It's been very much China. Lately, we have been extending the geographical area, but it's been, I think it's been 90% as was mentioned.
Yeah, you know,
but I think also that both Eastern Europe and the other Asian countries are going up there.
Yeah, and I think it's not a deliberate decision not to do furniture. You know, there's, you know, for retail companies, there are hundreds of categories, lots of potential categories. And so some selection needs to be made to go and verify and test where the opportunities might exist. So far, in the initial waves of categories selected by Europris, they have not selected furniture, but it does not mean that in the future that those categories will not be selected for a new wave potentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, let me take another question. This is coming through the chat. This is from Anthony. He's asking, this is probably a question for you, Knut. Based on this, how many percentage of your product and volume are you able to shift away from China? What is the goal in terms of volume and timeline?
I think that's a difficult question, but I think we can move quite much. Our intention is not to move too much. It is, as I said, also risk management, and it's also about what is the cost benefit of taking it away. But there is a large potential. But and it's not a single answer to that question, because the work needs to be done in all categories and in all product groups. And I think that's maybe the first misunderstanding, that it's easy to shift. based on regulations and the need we have, it's not easy to shift. It's very often one by one product. So it's a long process. And that's probably also why we see that quite many is talking about reducing the dependency, but very many seems not to do that, in fact, because it's complicated and it's one by one, and there is a lot of work in doing it. But we don't have a final goal to say that it should be very, very low figures, because that's
Okay.
I don't think it's realistic.
Richard, you're talking to, yeah, if you're talking to, when you're talking to clients, do they actually set, goals with, with fixed numbers or percentage that they are looking to shift away? Are they clear, guidelines that they have?
No, they don't usually have a specific target, because of course the story is very category specific. Every category is a different story. And so you might be very successful in one category, and you might have absolutely no opportunities in other categories. So it's extremely difficult to set a general target. You've got to really look at it category per category, and go through the process and see if you find opportunities or not. It's also important to take, I think, a strategic longer-term perspective in these types of programs. It can happen quite frequently that when we do this kind of work, there isn't an immediate savings to be had when you kind of look at the current price that you're paying with the Chinese supplier, and then you look at the quotes that you're getting from, let's say, the East European suppliers, and you compare them on a DDP level, to make sure you're comparing like for like. It's still quite frequently the case that the Chinese suppliers will come in at a lower price today. But as Knut was saying, you've got to work with those suppliers. I know that, when you show up at those suppliers' premises, start engaging with them, discussing with them longer-term relationships, suddenly the prices are beginning to shift compared to the initial quotes we're getting. And also, you've got to take a longer-term perspective in the sense that, the cost increases in China will continue to occur. And so the differential, the competitiveness of China will reduce over time. And there is also somewhat of a first mover advantage. If you're just looking to establish a relationship with an immediate saving, and you say, well, if I don't get an immediate saving, I'm not going to proceed, and you don't build those relationships with those new suppliers in Eastern Europe, well, maybe in a year from now or 18 months from now, when the competitive landscape has now shifted to the advantage of the East European suppliers, well, the companies that would have moved, that would have made those initial build those initial relationships, they will now be in a very strong advantage position compared to those that would have given up 12 months before. So it's also very important to take a dynamic view of the situation, not just taking a situation as of today, and really kind of think about this thing a bit more strategically.
Okay, let's move on. We have a lot of questions coming in. This is from Francesca, who's asking, do you have a more granular overview? Could you speak about what type of production activity is moved away from China to rest and other seeded countries? Is it more of blue collar labor rather than white collar one?
I mean, based on my experience, the problem we have is, of course, we have very partial experience from the work we're doing, so it's difficult for us to draw general conclusions. But I would say that one rule of thumb is that what I would describe as assembly products, when you have to assemble products into a finished good, those tend to be more challenging to shift than when you're just buying either a simple component, I don't know if you're buying a plastic injection molded part or a casting or a forging. If it's just one process technology versus an assembly of a lot of components, it is much more challenging to succeed, because what we're finding is that when we're looking outside of China, they very frequently don't have locally many of the components they need, and hence they have to import them frequently from China. And so they are immediately at a disadvantage, when they have to assemble components that are coming from China and just try to take advantage of the lower cost of assembly. Very frequently, they just don't have the competitive position to make that happen. So that's, I would say, a rule of thumb. You know, the more complex the assembly that you're buying, the more complex it will be to be successful at shifting from China to other countries.
No, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree very much.
Okay. Another question also asking, to what extent is the shift of production from China to Vietnam, Cambodia, India, and so on due to supply chain issues, trade barrier, etc., and not due to low cost of labor in the labor pool of countries?
I think that by us, we didn't experience very much supply chain issues during the pandemic due to we had feet on the street and so on. So supply chain issues has not been a factor at all, actually. And I think this is more opportunity driven. We want to explore the opportunities to a little bit like Richard said, being in the forefront. We need to see the total picture quite early to be able to do some changes. And if changes is needed, let's do it first. So it's not out of, for instance, cost and salaries and those kind of things. But what I hear and pick up also from, for instance, China is there are quite some suppliers in China then establishing in India, establishing in Vietnam and so on. My impression is that that is very much driven to because of the American market, and the efficiency is lower than China. The salaries is lower, but the end cost is more or less the same. But still, it's a lower risk if something bad should occur in the future.
Yeah, I think the risk management aspect is critical here. I mean, you know, having so much exposure to just one country with, you know, the known political tensions that are rising between China and, let's say, the Western world. I think many companies are concerned about, you know, what might happen if, you know, there is some kind of a crisis occurring, and, you know, the entire supply chain could be at risk, of course. So there is that key element. And as Knut was saying, I think the Chinese suppliers are well aware of this. Many of the Chinese suppliers are investing heavily in Southeast Asia, investing in Africa, investing in Mexico even sometimes now, to try to position their footprint in countries which, you know, will be somewhat decoupled from the risk issue associated with being in China. So the Chinese suppliers, there's two types. There's some Chinese suppliers that are kind of regrouping for the Chinese market and saying, okay, they understand they might be losing some share in the global market. And other Chinese suppliers who know they want to keep on participating in the global markets, and many of them now are, of course, investing quite heavily in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe to a lesser extent, Africa, Mexico also to some extent, trying to respond to these trends.
Yeah, Richard, you mentioned that. Yeah,
I spoke to two suppliers in China recently, and they said that we go to India and Vietnam because for us this is risk management. That was also quite interesting. So they are exactly on the same page.
Okay, and that's a good strategy. That's a good strategy to follow, by the way, for companies that are buying, I would say, complex assemblies, finished goods that are fairly complex. Looking for indigenous suppliers in Vietnam or India that have the capability is going to be very tough. But looking for Chinese suppliers that have the capability to do it in China, that have invested in this technology, let's say in India or Vietnam or Cambodia, that is usually a better strategy because they know how to make these products. They set up the assembly factory in those countries. They import many of the components from China to get them assembled in let's say Vietnam or Cambodia or India, and then they don't actually have to pay the 25% duties, of course, going into the US, assuming, of course, they've got at least 35% content, of course, in those factories. So they have to have, of course, a minimum level of content of those in those factories. But that could be a winning strategy, the one we suggest to our clients that are buying complex assemblies. is to find those Chinese companies that have decided to invest in those assembly operations outside of China.
Richard, do you feel, and maybe this is also a question for you, Knut, that if there was a major crisis happening in China again, and I'm referring to a potential conflict with Taiwan, do you think that companies have a plan B? I mean, are we talking about borders being closed, trade sanctions, all the shipping lanes, from all the major ports completely stopped or disrupted, a number of factories being shut down? Are those companies ready for that? And do they have a plan B to be able to sustain their supply back to Europe or the US?
I'm going to let Knut respond to that one because
I think the best one is a little bit prepared, and that's all.
A little bit prepared. So okay.
Yeah,
so there was a major crisis tomorrow. You could not handle it, right?
I think at least the retail business at a global level will have a very large challenge. We are not there yet.
Okay, so major disruption.
Yeah.
Yeah, because China still accounts, for those retail type categories. China probably still accounts for 50% of global trade, and so if those supply chains are damaged, then it's going to become very, very complicated. Sure.
So it would be catastrophic for all those retailers. Yeah,
I think it will be.
Okay, we have a question coming also. This is talking about sustainability. So sustainability and reducing emissions are part of the European Green Deal and the UN Sustainability Development Goals. How big is a share of this particular decision-making factor when deciding for other procurement market than China?
Many of our products is quite cheap, and then making them far away, transporting them a lot, it could be questions with that kind of aspect. And of course, therefore, we are always looking into opportunities to put it into more near sourcing. That's not the main reason or the only reason, but it's a part of the picture, I would say. But there are no single main reason. We want to prepare for the future. We want to be prepared if something happens, as you mentioned, with the big crisis. And I don't think we will be able to be 100% prepared, but we are trying to go in that direction.
Yeah, but I agree with Knut. I think the CO2 footprint, of course, is an element in this whole decision-making process, which, of course, is driving companies to try to make this move. But it's just one element amongst many others, the risk element, the cost element, the lead times element. All these things come into the equation, and it's a combination of all of those which is driving this trend, of course.
Okay. We have a question also from Vijay, who's asking, in your opinion, what is the Chinese reaction to traditional procurers diversifying sources of supply to other countries?
Well, I think I was responding to that a bit before. I think there's one response, of course, is for some of these Chinese companies to set up factories outside of China, and they've done that in a big way. Many suppliers, many companies in China have done that, focusing mainly on Vietnam initially, but not only now, also Cambodia, Indonesia, Thailand, the whole of Southeast Asia, India, increasingly as well. Africa, you take a country like Ethiopia, lots of Chinese investments. It's slowing down a bit now because of the political situation in Ethiopia, but the east corner of Africa, seeing a lot of investment from the Chinese companies, particularly in the textile area, of course, to supply the EU. So yeah, that's been one response. Another response is to look for other markets. They understand, of course, they're going to be losing market share definitely in the US. So in a strange way, sometimes this can sometimes be an opportunity for other markets, even in the EU, if Chinese suppliers anticipate some potential loss of market share in the US, they're looking aggressively for other markets, including the EU, which is, I would say, less affected because they don't have these big tariffs of the 25% on many goods. So they are, of course, aggressively looking for other markets. There's huge development of business with Russia right now, between China and Russia. Huge business between those two countries now. But also looking at the Middle East, looking at Latin America, so the Chinese are really looking for alternative markets, of course, as well, in addition to setting up factories in other countries.
Okay. We have a question from Adrian who's asking, this is for you, Knut. What is the main reason for Europris to shift a part of their supply chain to other countries?
I think also I answered that, and there is not one main reason, but there is many factors. We have touched upon them sometimes, and I think we'll leave it there.
Okay. All right, so we're looking at, there's another question from Ivan as well, talking about AI, which I think is an interesting question. Are you planning to leverage AI capabilities in procurement? Manual reviews tend to reach a productivity plateau. What is your view on predictive procurement capabilities?
Knut, are you investing in AI within?
I think this is a little bit outside the agenda, Max, and of course it's on the table. But I will not further comment it.
But we are in
okay, so maybe we should.
Yeah, we're investing in AI. But as Knut was describing the process we go through, we have to really collect and analyze a huge amount of data. You could see there in the case study that we had identified 680 odd something suppliers. Just identifying those suppliers takes a lot of time. You know, we have to go through all types of databases and websites and what have you to identify them. Then we have to go and check every one of those websites of all of those suppliers to verify as best we can on the website whether the product that they're making is relevant for the client, whether they appear to be a manufacturer or a trader. And all this is extremely time consuming. And of course, when it's time consuming, it's costly to do that. So we're now investing in AI to see if we can, to some extent, automate that process where we can automatically go into the websites, scrape the websites, identify key information on the website so that all this thing could be done in a much more efficient fashion. And we could accelerate, if you will, the initial phase of the process so that, you know, it becomes faster and more cost effective to go and scan the whole world for alternative suppliers. So that's what we are doing right now in terms of AI to try to improve the productivity of the process of trying to find suppliers outside of China.
Okay. There's a comment as well from Xavier is saying, okay, you want to stop manufacturing in China, why not? But what about the complexity of a global supply chain or increasing of costs in China for raw material? A large part of raw materials come from China and you have to export them to Bangladesh, Vietnam, and the other countries. It's true. So what's your view on this?
Yeah, it's one of the comments I was making before. It's definitely one of the challenges associated with trying to find supplies outside of China. China has a lot going for itself, including a local raw material supply markets for all key raw materials that are pretty competitive. And hence, yeah, one of the challenges when looking for supplies outside of China is that particular issue. Access to the raw materials, which are going to be competitive. Access to the components, not only the raw materials, to the key components if you're making complex assemblies. That will be competitively sourced from that local country. And often it is the case that the advantage you're getting in the assembly of the product, because of the labor cost being lower in Vietnam or Cambodia, will not be sufficient to compensate for the disadvantage you have on the raw material and component side. That's the reason why it remains a challenge, but it's also the reason why a strategic perspective is important. You know, just kind of focus your attention on immediate savings. You know, okay, you're going to limit what you're going to do. So hence, I think the need to take a bit more of a strategic perspective, looking at these cost positions in a more dynamic way and anticipating what's going to happen in 12, 24 months from now, where what looks like a cost disadvantage today for some countries will probably turn into a cost advantage in a couple of years from now. But if you've not done anything to build relationships between now and those next 2 years, well, you will be at a great disadvantage when the time comes to shift your volume from China to other countries.
Okay, all right. So with those final thoughts, I think it's time for us to wrap up this webinar. It's nearly the end of the hour. We have other questions, and I want to apologize to those who could not give the answer. But we will invite you again. We actually have a group on WhatsApp which we invite everybody, and you guys can continue asking questions. We will also be doing a roundtable discussion on the same topic on September 21st, and we'll be inviting you as well to the discussion. So if you have any question for Richard, which will be present at the roundtable, you can also ask him at that time. September 21st, just we'll send you information after this event. I want to thank you again, Richard, for sharing your insight. Thank you, Knut, for being here today and sharing your experience at Europris and working with Dragon Sourcing. And I want to thank again all the attendees for joining us today. If you missed part of the discussion, don't worry. We'll be sharing the recording the next 24 hours, so you can watch it again, and then you'll be able to see the complete presentation again of this event. Thank you again very much, all of you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.